All right, we're going to keep rolling here. Get all these PowerPoints rolling. Let's see. Okay, so let me jump ahead here. What we've got to now with the destruction of the northern kingdom, 722 BC, we're now going to come to the reign of Hezekiah here in just a moment. And before we do that, though, we're going to review, if I can get this thing on there right, our chart. Okay, so we have Genesis, the book of beginnings. Job, the book of undeserved suffering. Exodus for redemption, the book of redemption. Leviticus, the book of holiness. Numbers, the book of wanderings. Deuteronomy, the book of review. Remember, these at the bottom are not moving things along chronologically. Then we have Joshua, the book of conquest. We have Judges, the book of failure, with Ruth in there as the book of beauty. The book of transition, 1 Samuel, with the reign of Saul, taking place around chapters 10, 11, through the rest of the book. And then with 2 Samuel, the book of David's reign. David reigns throughout the whole book. He writes the Psalms, the book of praise. And then Chronicles parallels 1 and 2 Samuel. Then we have 1 Kings, the book of disruption, when the kingdom is divided. First 11 chapters give us the reign of Solomon, who wrote Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. Then with 1 Kings, we have the division of the kingdom in chapter 12, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. It continues on into 2 Kings with both kingdoms, but in chapter 17, the northern kingdom of Israel goes out. Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, parallels 1 and 2 Kings. We've already seen how Chronicles tells us the rest of the story and some key sections. That brought us to looking at the prophets, plugging them into 2 Kings. In 2 Kings 8, we have Obadiah, the book of Edom's doom, and it's a book to the foreign nations. The first prophet for the southern kingdom is the book of Joel, the book of Judah's judgment, or you could call it the judgment on Judah. Then you have Jonah, the prophet who didn't want to be a prophet, or at least he didn't want to be a prophet to Nineveh. He would have rather been able to take the message Nahum gets to take, but he doesn't get to take that message, the prophet to Nineveh. And then we have two northern prophets to the northern kingdom, that is, although Amos is not from the northern kingdom. Amos is our first one. And then we have Hosea, the book of loyal love, Hosea. Then we're going to have Isaiah and Micah here in a moment. And because you asked, we'll go, oh, I thought I had all of it on there. Sorry about that. Thought I had it all. I was going to run that through. So we have Isaiah and Micah going to be during the reign of Hezekiah. So what we're looking at is the reign of Hezekiah sets us up for the background of Isaiah and Micah, who will be contemporaries. Isaiah overlaps even the 722 event. Or no, he doesn't. No, he doesn't. Never mind. Forget that last point. Just scratch that. You delete that off. That's right. The southern kingdom of Judah and its prophets before 586 BC. The historical background of the books of Isaiah and Micah. 2 Kings 16, 7 and 9. Assyria was a major power during the time of Isaiah. They were already on the rise. Verse 9, so the king of Assyria listened to him, and the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and captured it and carried the people of it away into exile to Kir and put Rezin to death. So they're already on the rise before before Israel goes out under judgment. 2 Kings 18:4, Hezekiah destroyed the idols that had become objects of worship. We finally have a king who gets rid of the high places. In verse 3 of 18, he did right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. He removed the high places and broke down the sacred pillars and cut down the Asherah. He also broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made, For until those days the sons of Israel burned incense to it, and it was called Nehushtan. They had turned something God had legitimately given to Israel into an idol. He, that is Hezekiah, trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor among those who were before him. For he clung to the Lord. He did not depart from following him, but kept his commandments which the Lord had commanded Moses. That's a glowing report. That's the best one we've seen pretty much on any of the kings of Judah. 2 Chronicles 29:3 through 30, verse 12. Hezekiah accomplished a lot of good. We won't read through it. There's a large section there. But he opened the temple doors closed by his father Ahaz. 2 Chronicles 29:3. He opened the temple doors. He commissioned the priests and Levites to cleanse the temple. 2 Chronicles 29:4 through 19. The temple had been left in disrepair. The next time we see this type of thing happening will be in the reign of Josiah, when they'll find the book of the law. Hey, we got the book of the law here. Been lost to them. He had the correct sacrifices offered. 2 Chronicles 29:20 through 36. He planned a special Passover that had to be delayed a month because so few priests were qualified ceremonially. They had to get people reestablished, reordained, and everything ready to go. And they had to delay it. But his first time Passover had been observed in no telling how long. He invited people from every tribe, including those in the north who had lost their king and capital city a few years earlier. So he's working on the healing of things going on. Second Kings 18:7. Hezekiah refused to continue giving tribute to the Assyrians. It says, and the Lord was with him. Wherever he went, he prospered. And he rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. Verses 13 through 16. Hezekiah then was afraid. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, it's about 701 BC, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and seized them. And Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear. So here he's crawfishing back now in regards to what he had done before. Verse 15, Hezekiah gave him all the silver which was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. So he gives them things from the temple. Verse 13, Hezekiah was terrified of a war with the Assyrian army. He's afraid of what's going to happen. Hezekiah did not trust Yahweh, and so requested peace terms with Assyria. He's not trusting him at the time. It'd be probably a better way to understand that. Verses 15 through 16, to pay the tribute, Hezekiah emptied the temple and palace treasuries and even stripped gold from the temple's doors and pillars. What he had done before and adding it, now he takes it away to give it to the Assyrians. And do you expect that it would have satisfied the Assyrians? Not at all. It made them want more. King Sennacherib's first threat, verse 17. Then the king of Assyria sent Tartan and Rabasaris and the Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah with a large army to Jerusalem. So he sends his field marshal and his chief officers to see Hezekiah. So they went up and came to Jerusalem. And when they went up, they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is on the highway of the fuller's field. In other words, they come to the laundromat, because this is where everybody did their laundry here. When they called to the king, Eliakim the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna the scribe, and Joah the son of Asaph the recorder, came out to them. Then Rabshakeh said to them, Say now to Hezekiah, Thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, What is this confidence you have? Now this is something to watch as we go through this, as we see this taunting that takes place. You say, verse 20, but they are only empty words. I have counsel and strength for war. Now on whom do you rely that you have rebelled against me? Now behold, you rely on the staff of this crushed reed, even on Egypt, on which if a man leans, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh king of Egypt to all who rely on him. They were trying to trust in Egypt as an ally. But if you say to me, we trust in the Lord our God, now watch this. Is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away, and has said to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem? See what had happened with the leaving of the high places. The rest of the world thought they worshiped the God of God Yahweh like everybody else, just different wherever they wanted to. And so when Hezekiah comes along and does away with those high places finally, the rest of the world goes, well, he's changed their religion. He's changed the way they worship. No, actually, he brought it back the way it was supposed to be. But because it had been there for so long, even the world had begun to recognize that it was something that was ongoing in Israel. So in verse 23, now therefore come make a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria, and I will give you 2,000 horses, if you're able on your part to set riders on them. Kind of sarcastic. How then can you repulse one official, the least of my master's servants, and rely on Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? Have I now come up without the Lord's approval against the place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, go up against this land and destroy it. So now he's trying to make this into a theological issue. Now watch this. Then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and Shebna, and Joah said to Rabshakeh, speak now to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. And do not speak with us in Judean in the hearing of the people who are on the wall. In other words, you're scaring the fire out of everybody. Quit talking about these things. Just talk to us and we'll tell them, we'll put our twist on it. But Rabshakeh said to them, has my master sent me only to your master and to you to speak these words, and not to the men who sit on the wall, doomed to eat their own dung and drink their own urine with you? That's some graphic terms. Then Rabshakeh stood and cried with a loud voice in Judean, saying, hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you from my hand. Nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, saying, the Lord will surely deliver us, and this city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me, and come out to me, and eat each of his vine, and each of his fig tree, and drink each of his waters of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread. And he goes in and describes it. But do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Now, this is where he starts to make really big mistake. Verse 33. This is the sixth argument he's brought up in this whole course of things. Has any one of the gods of the nations delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of the Severim, Henah and Ivah? Have they delivered Samaria from my hand? Who among all the gods of the lands have delivered their land from my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem from my hand? Wrong thing to say there, Rabshakeh, because you're about to find out how it's going to happen. 1 through 7, we have Hezekiah's first prayer in response to Sennacherib's first threat. And then we have the second threat in 8 through 13. And the denial or the defying of God gets worse. Now here's what we want to read now in verse 14, the second prayer. Hezekiah's second prayer. He placed Sennacherib's threat before the Lord. And this thing is written out in this letter, and he brings this letter before the Lord in the house of the Lord. Verse 14, and Hezekiah took the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it, and he went up to the house of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. Hezekiah prayed before the Lord and said, O Lord, the God of Israel, who are enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. You're the only God. You're the creator. Incline your ear, verse 16, O Lord, and hear. Open your eyes, O Lord, and see. And listen to the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to reproach the living God. Truly, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have devastated the nations in their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were not gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone, so they have destroyed them. Now, O Lord our God, I pray, deliver us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, O Lord, are God. He has a reason. It's not just for his own deliverance, but it's for the glory of God as well. In verse 15, Hezekiah understood the creator-creature distinction. He remembered that God is our creator and we are his creation. It's one of the fascinating prayers here. Verse 16, Hezekiah told God, Sennacherib has defied you. He has defied you by what he has said in this letter. And the letter was worse than what the Rabshakeh had said. 17 and 18, Hezekiah mentioned the uselessness of idolatry. He mentioned the uselessness of idolatry. They were not gods, but the work of men's hands. And then verse 19, the glory of God was Hezekiah's motivation. And God answered Hezekiah's prayer. He says, I have heard you, in verse 20. So in verse 21, this is the word that the Lord has spoken against him. She has despised you and mocked you, the virgin daughter of Zion. She has taken her head behind you, the daughter of Jerusalem, whom you have reproached and blasphemed. And against whom have you raised your voice and haughtily lifted up your eyes? Who have you done this to? In other words, against the Holy One of Israel. So Sennacherib, an instrument in the hands of the Creator, God, who controls history, he is working something here through Sennacherib. Skip down to verse 27. But I know you're sitting down, and you're going out, and you're coming in, and you're raging against me. Because of your raging against me, and because your arrogance has come up to my ears, therefore I will put my hook in your nose. I got a hurt. And my bridle in your lips, and I will turn you back by the way which you came. Then this shall be the sign for you. You will eat this year what grows of itself, in the second year what springs from the same, and in the third year sow, reap, plant vineyards, and eat their fruit. God gives Hezekiah a sign that these things are going to come about. So the remnant of Israel will return and prosper again, even with the Syrians doing what they're doing at this point. The surviving remnant of the house of Judah will again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem will go forth a remnant, and out of Mount Zion survivors. The zeal of the Lord will perform this. Notice the zeal of the Lord. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he will not come to this city or shoot an arrow there, and he will not come before it with a shield or throw up a siege ramp against it. He's not going to get to do anything. He says that they're not even going to touch it. By the way that he came, by the same he will return, and he shall not come to this city, declares the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it, note, for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. So it's not just for the glory of the Lord that he's going to perform this, it's for the Davidic covenant, as we've seen before. So the Assyrians would not touch Jerusalem. Now I love this next, it's just very short, but check out this. Then it happened. Love it when the author puts it this way, just then it happened. You know it's going to be short usually. That night, that the angel of the Lord, now remember Hezekiah, when that letter came, and he's before the Lord, all the Assyrian army is camped outside of Jerusalem around the walls. 185,000. Then it happened that night that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men rose early in the morning, behold, all of them were dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. What we find out later with the Sennacherib prism, he talks about all his conquests leading up to Jerusalem. And then it just stops. And he says we returned home. He doesn't talk about how he lost 185,000 in one night without even fighting a battle. But he does record his other victories. Point to ponder. Sennacherib made a terrible mistake in thinking that Jerusalem was just another city with just another king with just another God. Because Jerusalem was protected by the King of Kings, and Sennacherib was a mere pawn in his hand. He says, long ago I did it. From ancient times I planned it. Now I have brought it to pass. He was just a pawn. Isaiah prophesied the doom of the Assyrian army in attacking Jerusalem. This comes in Isaiah chapter 10. And we're getting ready to study just a little bit about the book of Isaiah. Isaiah 10, verse 5. We won't read through the whole verses to 19. Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hands is my indignation. I sent it against a godless nation, and commissioned it against the people of my fury, to capture booty and to seize plunder, and to trample them down, the mud in the streets. And you keep having more and more things like that throughout that prophecy. 2 Kings 19:35-36, the angel of the Lord fought for Israel, and the Assyrian army lost 185,000 men in one night. Imagine Hezekiah waking up that morning, looking out and seeing the slain. 2 Chronicles 32:21. And the Lord sent an angel who destroyed every mighty warrior, commander, and officer in the camp of the king of Assyria. So he returned in shame to his own land. And when he had entered the temple of his God, some of his own children killed him there with the sword, just as God had prophesied. 2 Kings 19:7, Isaiah 37:38, Sennacherib's sons killed him. Remember the prophecy, behold, I will put a spirit in him so that he will hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land. His own children are the ones that do it. So now, again, the chronology of the prophets, 931, division of the kingdom. Assyria starts coming on the rise in 880. Obadiah fits into 2 Kings chapter 8. Then we have Joel, the first prophet to the southern kingdom. Then we have Jonah to Assyria, to the Ninevites, Amos and Hosea. And now we'll come to Isaiah and Micah. And I was right. He does overlap 7:22. Every now and then I'm right. So the book of Isaiah, the book of God's servant. The book of God's servant. There's more messianic prophecy in Isaiah than any of the other books. Isaiah's name means Yahweh is salvation. His ministry lasted 40 years. Yahweh is salvation. The book of Isaiah divides naturally into two sections. Chapters 1-39, the judgment of God. In chapters 40-66, the salvation of God. And when you get into chapters 40-66, this is where we get into the suffering servant passages, especially 52 and 53 there. We read 61 earlier, which dealt with, and we saw how the Lord read that in Luke chapter 4. In Isaiah 7, 1-17, we have a major prophecy. The Messiah would be born of a virgin. So we're going to study this just a little bit. In Isaiah 7-12, they form a single unit, often called the book of Emmanuel, God with us. The name Emmanuel appears 3 times in the text. That's why it's called the book of Emmanuel. You have it in 7:14, which we will read, and you have it in 8:8 and 8:10. A child's name reflects the thinking of his parents. Of course, the eternal Son is named by the Father, Emmanuel, God with us. God named the promised child Emmanuel to indicate the very nature of the child, God with us. The child would be God living among men. So in Isaiah 7, 1-2, we have a threat against the house of David with the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire, a rising power, threatened many smaller kingdoms. It says now, verse 1, it came about in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, that Rezin, the king of Aram, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, but could not conquer it. When it was reported to the house of David, saying, the Arameans have camped in Ephraim, his heart and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake with the wind. So they're afraid of what's going to happen with this. You've got this coalition coming against them. Among those threatened were Syria, Aram, the northern kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom of Judah. They're all mentioned here. The kings of Israel and Syria joined forces, but still did not have enough military force to withstand the Assyrian war machine. They make an alliance, but it's not going to be enough. So they invite Judah to join them. But King Ahaz of Judah refused. Not that that's a bad thing that he does, but something else is going to happen. Israel and Syria, Aram, plotted to dethrone Ahaz, that is, destroy the house of David, and enthrone a new dynasty that would join them against the Assyrians. If they had succeeded in destroying David's family line, the Messiah could not have come into the world. So we got the Davidic covenant involved in all of this. And note what the Lord has Isaiah do. Then the Lord said to Isaiah, "Go out now to meet Ahaz. You and your son share Joshua," which means a remnant shall return, "at the end of the conduit of the upper pool and the highway to the fuller's field." So going back to the laundromat. "And say to him, take care and be calm, have no fear, and do not be faint-hearted because of these 2 stubs of smoldering firebrands, on account of the fierce anger of Rezin and Aram and the son of Remaliah." You shouldn't fear the smoldering firebrands. There's nothing to fear those. And so it's using language to paint the picture. "Because Aram with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has planned evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrorize it, and make for ourselves a breach in its walls, and set up the son of Tabeel as king in the midst of it. Thus says the Lord God, it shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass. For the head of Aram is Damascus, and the head of Damascus is Rezin. Now within another 65 years Ephraim will be shattered, so that it is no longer a people. And the head of Ephraim is Samaria, and the head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. If you will not believe, you surely shall not last." So the Lord is sending Isaiah there with a message. Now Ahaz, who is an idolater, was afraid of the attack. God told Isaiah to meet Ahaz, who was inspecting water supplies in preparation for a long battle against Jerusalem. The fuller's field, where they did their laundry, was also where you had one of your major water sources. So that's what he's doing down there. Kings don't normally do their own laundry. Maybe they should. God told Isaiah to take his son with him. His name was Share Joshua, meaning a remnant will return. So he says, "Come on, remnant will return. You got to go with me." Isaiah warned King Ahaz of the plot and told him not to be afraid. There's not anything to be afraid of, because God is not going to allow the house of David to be destroyed. Verse 10, "Then the Lord spoke again to Ahaz, saying, ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Make it deep as Sheol or as high as heaven." Literally, sky's the limit. Whatever you want as a sign, I'm going to give it to you. Now, you'd expect him to think up something. But God offered a sign to Ahaz as proof of his prophecy. But Ahaz the idolater did not trust God. He had greater faith in the Assyrian Empire than in the God of Israel. So his response is going to be rather interesting. Ahaz could request any miracle to clearly show that this promise was from the Lord. But note what he says. Verse 12. "But Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord." Now, what it is I don't want a sign, because then I'll have to do what you say do. I got my mind made up. Don't confuse me with the facts. I've already got my mind made up. Then he said, "Listen now, O house of David." Now, we've got to watch the language here. Watch how Isaiah speaks. He speaks to the whole house of David. "Listen now, O house of David. Is it too slight a thing for you to try the patience of men, that you will try the patience of my God as well? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign." Who's the you? House of David. "Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. He will eat curds and honey at the time he knows enough to refuse evil and choose good. For before the boy will know enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose 2 kings you dread," just shifted. Now he's talking to Ahaz, singular, "will be forsaken." So you've got 2 signs. You've got one to the house of David, which is the sign of the virgin child being born and named Emmanuel. Then you've got the sign to Ahaz, which is the boy with him. He has to bring remnant will return with him. He's got little remnant will return with him there to say, when this boy, before he's old enough to know, then you're going to have these 2 kings that you're dreading are going to be gone. So you got 2 signs. One to the whole house of David, which really is to the whole Israel. And you got one here with Ahaz. So this is what we got. We've seen this before. Let's check this out again. It's the near-far principle. Okay. We saw this in 1 Kings 13. Let's review it with that again. 1 Kings 13, the young prophet said that altar was going to have a king to come on, Josiah by name, and he would put on that altar the priests of the Baal, the priests of the idolatry, and sacrifice them on that. And then he said, but right now, this altar is going to split in half. And that happened right away. That was near. And it literally happened. We talked about that, I think it was very early this morning when Jeroboam put out his hand to seize him and it froze. Remember, I stood here for a long time frozen while we read through all that. And when the thing split, he realized he was talking to a prophet of God, and he said, hey, you want to pray to God for me and fix this? And he did. And then we saw what happened to the young prophet later. But nonetheless, he gave two prophecies. First, he gave the far one, and then he gave the near one. This one was fulfilled literally. That one will be fulfilled literally. I mean, it has been, but from where we are in the text yet, it hasn't. But it will be, and of course, it has been. Now, there were 300 years between fulfillments. But the only way to know it's fulfilled is for it to be literally fulfilled. Now, we took that and we looked at Isaiah 61. And we saw how the Lord read it in Luke 2 or Luke 4. This one, he says, I've come to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord has been fulfilled in your hearing that day. But he stopped short and didn't finish the whole passage. The rest of that passage from 2b onward is about the second advent when he comes to rule and reign. There's over 2,000 years between fulfillments. We've got the same thing here. I don't have it plugged in on this, but Emmanuel being born for, this is, I should have had the Isaiah up here, but I don't. This is when the Lord comes mounted on the foal of a donkey, and this is second advent. But picture in your mind Emmanuel being born here, 7:14, the sign to the house of David, and then this being the sign with the little remnant shall return here being fulfilled. So that's the remnant shall return, with little boy there, and then the far is when the Son of God will be born. So you got a near-far principle here in Isaiah chapter 7. It's those that have been run out by the Assyrians with the force that's coming in right now. They've run for the hills because of the Syrian, and now they'll come back. Okay, so you got the near-far principle here in this passage. Isaiah 7:12. Ahaz rejects God's offer of a sign. We saw that. He says, I'm not going to ask. Suddenly Ahaz became a fake religious person. Even in his idolatry, he still knew the one true God. He still knew the one true God. He did not want to ask for a sign because he knew God would do it. Then he would be forced to abandon his human viewpoint solution, or man's solution to a problem. He liked his solution. He wanted to make an alliance with Assyria. So he's kind of the opposite of Gideon. Gideon was wanting a sign so he wouldn't have to do anything. And this Ahaz, he doesn't want a sign in a different sort of way. Gideon knew what to do, didn't want to do it, was trying to prevent it. And now this guy's got another idea he wants to do, and he doesn't want a sign to have to change his mind on what he's got to do. Isaiah 7:13-14, the sign of the house of David. Verse 13, Isaiah prophesied to the entire house of David. So again, it's one of those places where you got to watch the change of pronouns and who's being addressed. Behold is used with a present participle indicating a future event. The Messiah's birth and miraculous conception. You have a miracle of conception and birth. So it draws the attention. Behold. The text specifically says the virgin. And the only possible reference is to God's promise in Genesis 3:15, the promise seed of the woman. On the study of the life of Christ, we do a lot more on the virgin birth out of this passage when we're in Matthew chapter 1. But the word here was Alma is not a technical word for virgin, but all the Jews understood that until after the church comes along, and the church was using this passage as such a defense for the virgin birth of Messiah, Jesus, who we claim as Messiah, the Jews reject, that all the rabbis went back and started changing their interpretation. They only changed it after they had rejected Jesus as Messiah. Normally the Bible describes people as from the seed of a man. However, the Messiah would be from the seed of the woman. We noted that when we were in Genesis. It seems like we were in Genesis forever, and now it seems like forever ago since we were in Genesis. Isn't that weird? Isaiah 7:15-17. The sign to Ahaz. This is the sign to Ahaz personally. Before Isaiah's son was old enough to make moral distinctions between right and wrong, the kings of Israel and Syria would be long gone. Verse 17 says, the Lord will bring on you, on your people, and on your father's house such days as have never come since the day that Ephraim separated from Judah, the king of Assyria. 3 years later, God had fulfilled this sign. So it was a near fulfillment, and it was literally fulfilled. So the other was literally fulfilled as well, the birth of Messiah. It's the only way you can know when a prophecy is literally fulfilled. Isaiah 7:1-17, Isaiah gave two signs. The first sign was to the house of David, could not be destroyed until the birth of a virgin-born son. You can't have a destruction of the house of David until this happens. So God would be protecting throughout even the silent years. And we've seen the genealogy several times already this week. 15 and 16, the second sign, the attack on Ahaz by Syria and Israel would not succeed. They would not be successful. So we get another link in the messianic chain or the messianic thread that runs throughout the Old Testament of the messianic hope. The unique birth is first announced in Genesis 3:15. And we find out he's going to be a king when Jacob's blessing his sons, and Judah is going to have the scepter. And then we have the prophet unto Moses, Deuteronomy. So he's going to be a king and a prophet with a unique birth. He's going to have an eternal kingdom, a Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7. And another aspect to the unique birth here in Isaiah 7:14 is going to be born of a virgin. And this helps explain this one back here, that unique birth. And later on, we learn he's going to have a forerunner, John the Baptist. So you've got this thread that runs through all of the Old Testament, pointing us to the Messiah who Isaiah writes the most about. So quickly here, we're going to plot back. We have Isaiah and now Micah. Micah is a contemporary with Isaiah. The book of Judah's judgment. The book of Judah's judgment. It's the second book of Judah's judgment. So if you want to call this one Judgment of Judah, do I? Part 2, can if you want to. Micah, whose name means who is like Yahweh, lived at the same time as Isaiah. But Isaiah's ministry is a lot longer. Micah's is a shorter one. And much shorter book as well. In Micah 1:6, Micah dealt primarily with Judah, but addressed the northern kingdom and predicted the fall of Samaria. So they're both ministering together before 722 BC. Isaiah goes much farther afterwards. It says, for I will make Samaria a heap of ruins in the open country, planting places for a vineyard. I will pour her stones down into the valley and will lay bare her foundations. All of her idols will be smashed. All of her earnings will be burned with fire, and all of her images I will make desolate. His message, along with Isaiah, sparked a spiritual awakening in the southern kingdom during the reign of Hezekiah. It's a spiritual awakening. Now, Micah and Isaiah are two different guys. I mean, big time. Two different aspects of two prophets here. Isaiah was a scholar in the royal court. Micah was a good old country boy. And I kind of like that aspect of him. He makes things a lot shorter as well. Isaiah was a voice to kings. Micah to the common people, those who weren't kings. See, Isaiah is part of the royal family, so he has access to all this. He's from in that line. Isaiah addressed political problems, and you expect him to do so as he's with the voice of the king. And it's also a lot of the reasons why he has a lot of the prophecy about the King of Kings. It's connected to that. Micah's book could be called the condensed or abridged edition of Isaiah's. The condensed edition. In Micah 6:8, Micah gave God's expectations for his covenant people. Micah 6 verse 8, He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. The two go together. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. They're two sides of the same coin. Here, the way it's described is the doing of justice, of love, and kindness, and walking humbly before the Lord. That's what God had called them to do. Micah 5:2, Micah added to the understanding of Messiah's birth by giving the location. It says, But as for you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. The one to be born in Bethlehem would go forth for me, he says. It's God who is making this statement. He will go forth for me to be ruler. But the one who goes forth, his days are from eternity. So he's eternal. So he's the eternal Son going forth for the Father. The human origin of Messiah would be Bethlehem, but his divine existence is from all eternity. As John writes, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was face to face with God, and the Word was God. What is true of God the Father is also true of the one born in Bethlehem. So Messiah would be human, born at a specific point in human history, space-time continuum, and yet would have existed since eternity past. Therefore, we know that he is God. There's an interesting New Testament connection that goes with this in Matthew chapter 2. Let's turn over there real quick. When the Magi come to town, year and a half, close to 2 years after the birth of Messiah. That's the thing. In our times of Christmas, we often go with a lot of traditions, and that's necessarily wrong, but a lot of them aren't out of the Bible. And if you're going to have your nativity scene, to keep it in scale, you have the manger scene here, and you should have the wise men about 3 rooms down the hall, taking them a while to get there. See, they're not going to be there when he's a child. He's not an infant when they arrive. Anyhow, that's just do what you want to do. My kids like to do that because I've talked about that so much. In Matthew 2, verse 1, Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who's born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. That's a weird star they see because that star comes and goes and moves and rests right on a house and doesn't burn it up. It's something supernatural. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And the reason is because when Herod gets trouble, usually somebody lost their life, and it could be a number of people. So when Herod's upset, everybody look out. Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, Herod inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. Now watch this. They said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea. I mean, it's like, duh, where else would he be born? For this is what has been written by the prophet. They know it. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. They quote Micah right on the barrelhead here. and it doesn't have any impact on them at all. They don't go to check it out or anything. And Herod secretly called the Magi, determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. And when you have found him, report to me so that I too may come and worship him." Of course, he was lying. He wants to execute him. After hearing the king, they went their way. And the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. Again, that's a kind of a strange star. And they rejoiced when they see it, because that implies that it had disappeared on them. So when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. After coming into the house, not into the stable or the where the animals are, but into a house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left their own country by another way. And that in itself is a miracle, because Herod had the greatest spy network of the ancient world. He was a paranoid ruler. And when you're paranoid, you want to know what everybody's doing. And he had all these towers built all around, so no one came and went without his knowledge. And it's not just the three wise guys. It's more than that. They would travel with this whole entourage. And so it's at least 40 of them. Some say over 400 of them, but I'm going to put the number 40 on it. And for that group to get out of there without Herod knowing it is a miracle. But nonetheless, they were able to do so. But the key is, the connection is to Micah 5. They knew where Messiah was going to be born. Now, let's very quickly, we'll look at something. I'll try and have a better slide of this later. The mountain peaks of prophecy. Mountain peaks of prophecy, we look at things from an Old Testament prophet perspective. They saw these two mountain peaks. Saw information about a suffering servant, information about a son being born, and then they saw information about a ruling king, like in Malachi 4, how Malachi ends. Now what happens over time, especially like when you get into Isaiah 52 and 53, where you clearly have the suffering servant who dies, and you also have him ruling. They got to focusing more here than they did here, especially with the Pharisees. And as we saw in Isaiah 61, from 1 to 2a, the Lord says, "This has been fulfilled in your hearing, favorable year of the Lord, but the day of vengeance is yet to come." And so as they focused on these things, this began to fade out. This began to get bigger in their sights. And what the Pharisees taught, the way they reconciled this, what they taught was that when Messiah comes, if Israel's living in disobedience, then he's going to come to suffer to pay for the sins of the nation. But if Israel's living in obedience, then he's going to come to rule. Well, what are you going to think? You think you're doing all right, we're being obedient. They're always looking for a king. That's what they were looking for. That's why they were so upset. When Jesus comes, he doesn't come and give them a big hug. He rebukes them again and again and again. What these guys couldn't see was what was in the valley, and that was the church. And Paul says, if Israel's rejection of Messiah has brought us in, then just imagine what Israel's acceptance is going to do. It's going to usher in the kingdom. And so you've got these mountain peaks of prophecy that go along with that telescoping aspect that we talked about before. And we'll put the two together hopefully in another slide later. All right, I need to change PowerPoints here. Whew, gotta change everybody here. I got them all running all over the place. Okay, here we go. So now we're getting ready for the book of Nahum. This is the message Jonah wanted to deliver, but God didn't let him. All right, let's plot this again. Got Obadiah, chapter 8 of 2 Kings, Joel in chapter 12, Jonah in in between chapters 13 and 14, Amos chapter 15, Hosea chapter 15. Now we've had Isaiah in the time of Hezekiah, Micah in the time of Hezekiah. Now we're going to get Nahum in the time of chapter 21. So, book of Nineveh's doom. The book of Nineveh's doom. We've got to get the background set up with this. So 2 Kings 20:21. During Nahum's time, King Hezekiah died, and his son Manasseh ruled on the throne. Now there's one thing about Hezekiah we didn't do, just tell you about real quick that happened. When he fell sick, the Babylonians had heard about it. Isaiah came to him, and he comes to him and says, sorry you're sick, but you're going to die. See you later. And he's headed down the steps, and the Lord comes to Isaiah and says, go tell him he's going to live. Because and this was before the Assyrian crisis, but it's thematically put in a different place. And Isaiah goes back up to tell him, says, you're going to live. And they give him some fig cakes, and he eats, and he asks, what sign do you want, and whether the shadow would go up or down. So he asked for the shadow to go in the opposite direction it should go. And he gets some verification that he's going to live. But he got a letter from the Babylonian ambassadors, and they came to see him. And he was so glad that the Babylonians came to see him. And so he said, let me show you guys the temple treasures. And they go, yeah, we'd love to see the temple treasures. And he takes them in there, and the whole time they're going, You know, they're taking notes of all that's in the temple treasury. And that's how Nebuchadnezzar knows what's in the temple treasury when he comes to town to raid the place. And Isaiah tells, when they leave, he comes to Hezekiah and says, so, you know, what was going on? What was you doing? Well, they wanted to see me. I showed them the temple treasures. And I said, Isaiah says, you've acted foolishly. They're all going to be taken away. And Hezekiah's attitude is, as long as it doesn't happen in my day. That's exactly what he said. Well, not exactly, but pretty close. What he says, as long as it doesn't happen in my time. And that's like most politicians today. As long as they can get things moving long enough for them to die, they're not worried about the future. It's pretty typical of the temporal focus. And so it was a failure of Hezekiah on his part there. Anyhow, we need to have that set up before we get to Daniel's time. So Hezekiah died, and his son Manasseh rules from 686 to 642. 2 Kings 21:9, Manasseh was an evil king and purposely copied the wickedness of the Canaanites. It says, but they did not listen, and Manasseh seduced them to do evil more than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the sons of Israel. He takes it to a new level. Verse 2 of chapter 21, he did evil in the sight of the Lord according to the abominations of the nations whom the Lord dispossessed before the sons of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places. We've finally had a king to get rid of them, and the very next one rebuilds them, which Hezekiah his father had destroyed. And he erected altars for Baal and made an Asherah, as Ahab king of Israel had done, and worshipped all the host of heaven and served them. He built altars in the house of the Lord. Verse 6, he made his sons pass through the fire, practiced witchcraft, and used divination, and dealt with mediums and spirits. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord. Verse 7, he set the carved image of the Asherah that he had made in the house of which the Lord said to David and to his son Solomon, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. So he's done all these blasphemous things. He does great evil just like Ahab. He's the worst of the southern kings. But we're going to see something interesting about him in a minute. Manasseh murdered many of the righteous remnant that had returned. Moreover, Manasseh shed very much innocent blood until he had filled Jerusalem from one end to another, besides his sin with which he made Judah sin in doing evil in the sight of the Lord. Since so few righteous remained in Israel, God had no reason to not send judgment on Judah. That's what's going to happen. This is going to be the point of no return. It's going to be reached during Manasseh's time. Among the innocent blood spilled on the streets of Jerusalem may have been that of the prophet Isaiah, which may be one of the ones that the writer of the Hebrews is referring to in Hebrews 11. That's traditional, anyway, that it was Isaiah, sawed in half. Even worse, most of the people tolerated the extreme idolatry of Manasseh, which resulted in the doom of Jerusalem and the temple, according to Jeremiah 7. But if we really want to know the full events of Manasseh, where we got to go? To Chronicles. Chronicles gives us the rest of the story. So let's go to 2 Chronicles 33. Because here we see something that we don't get into the Kings. Second Chronicles 33:10. The Lord spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they paid no attention. Therefore the Lord brought the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria against him, and they captured Manasseh with hooks, bound him with bronze chains, and took him to Babylon. The hooks would be in the nose. That's got us smart. Because it's not just like a nose ring, it's like a nose and pulling him by the nose to Babylon. But watch this, verse 12. When he was in distress, he entreated the Lord his God, and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. When he prayed to him, he was moved by his entreaty, and heard his supplication, and brought him again to Jerusalem to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord was God. Note, he humbled himself. He had taken the southern kingdom of Judah past the point of no return. Yet, in his distress, as an individual, he humbled himself before the Lord, and the Lord gave him grace. God gives grace to the humble. He restores him to the kingdom. And Manasseh goes and tries to undo all that he had done. Nevertheless, verse 17, the people still sacrificed in the high places, although only to the Lord their God. The high places remain. Ashurbanipal pronounced Manasseh guilty, and as a war trophy had him dragged across the desert in chains with a hook through his nose. And that would be humiliating. Manasseh returned to God, and God's grace allowed him to return to Jerusalem as king. But it didn't undo the judgment. It was too late for that. See the same thing in Josiah's day. Josiah is a great king, does right in the sight of the Lord, but it doesn't stop the judgment from coming. So although he made changes, he could not turn back the evil he had begun. He could not turn back the evil. The people still rebelled against God. And then when his son comes to the throne, verse 21, Amon was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned 2 years in Jerusalem. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, as Manasseh his father had done. And Amon sacrificed to all the carved images which his father Manasseh had made, and he served them. So 21 through 25 there, Amon became king and canceled all the good reforms of his father Manasseh. He was soon murdered. During this time, the prophet Nahum, whose name means comfort, prophesied about Nineveh's destruction. He prophesied about Nineveh's destruction. So find Jonah, you go Micah, Nahum. In Nahum 3, 8 through 10, we read, Are you better than No Ammon, which was situated by the waters of the Nile, with water surrounding her, whose rampart was the sea, whose wall consisted of the sea? Ethiopia was her might, and Egypt too, without limits. Put and Lubim were among her helpers. Yet she became an exile. She went into captivity. Also her small children were dashed to pieces. At the head of every street they cast their lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound with fetters. Nahum wrote his book after 663 BC, the year the city of Thebes, Egypt, fell to the Assyrians. He used that historical event to prophesy the coming fall of Nineveh. Again, this is what Jonah would have really loved to have given. You know, I'm all for this one. Nineveh was the Assyrian capital located on the banks of the Tigris River. We saw that map earlier when we were looking at Jonah. The city, which had walls 100 feet high, strengthened by 1,200 towers, another 100 feet high, and was wide enough for 3 chariots to ride side by side, enclosed about, a lot of land. I mean, they got a highway system up there, logistically to support a siege for years. The city could maintain its own food supply, allowing it to withstand a 20-year attack. It's got its own water source as well. Nothing seemed more unlikely than Nahum's prophecy of Nineveh's doom. Nahum 1:8, but with an overflowing flood, he will make a complete end of its sight and will pursue his enemies into darkness. And when it goes down, it's not discovered again until like the 1800s. Was it late 1800s? Matter of fact, that was one of the things. It amazes me how often that happens. Those opposing the Bible come along like with the Hittites. There's no such thing as the Hittites. The Bible's wrong. And then they dig up this whole civilization of the Hittites. Nineveh didn't exist. And they dig up, it happens every time. It's amazing. Like God just lets them to figure out which way they're going to oppose it, and then we find it. In Nahum 2:6, floodwaters destroyed part of the wall. The gates of the rivers are opened, and the palace is dissolved. And with that destruction part of the wall, they were overrun. And the Babylonians are the one that did it. And then the Babylonians are going to be conquered by the Persians the same way. Well, sort of the same way. The Medes and Babylonian partnership completely destroyed Nineveh. The Medes and Babylonian partnership completely destroyed Nineveh. Not until 1842 was the site of Nineveh discovered. Nineveh depicts the disaster that befalls nations that practice anti-Semitism, that is, oppression of the Jewish people. Again, going back to Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 12. So that's it for Nahum. Now we're getting ready for Zephaniah, Habakkuk or Habakkuk, and Jeremiah. The historical background. Let's see if we can hit this real quick. 2 Kings 22:1 through 23:30. Josiah, a righteous king, brought good changes to the southern kingdom of Judah. Josiah is a righteous king. He's going to be a breath of fresh air. 2 Chronicles 34:3 through 7. At the age of 20, he began cleansing the land of every instrument of idolatry. He began cleansing the land of every instrument of idolatry. Jeremiah 25:3. A year later, the prophet Jeremiah began his ministry. So, at the age of 20, 21 is when Jeremiah begins his ministry. That doesn't mean Jeremiah is a young guy, but it means when his ministry begins. 2 Chronicles 34:8-9. At the age of 26, Josiah began repairing the temple. 34 verse 8. Now in the 18th year of his reign, when he had purged the land and the house, he sent Shaphan the son of Azaliah and Messiah, an official of the city, and Joah, and a bunch of other guys with hard names. And they came to Hilkiah the high priest, and delivered the money that was brought into the house of God, which the Levites, the doorkeepers, had collected from Manasseh and Ephraim, and from all the remnant of Israel, and from all Judah and Benjamin, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So he's repairing the temple. 2 Kings 22:8. In the process of cleansing the temple, priests discover a copy of the Torah. Imagine that. Then Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book of Shaphan, who read it. During the reign of Josiah, Babylon began to rise in power. Babylon began to rise in power. The Neo-Babylonian Empire became more powerful than the Assyrian Empire had been. Babylon began to dominate the Middle East. In each of these empires, the Assyrian was this size, and Babylonians, and the Medes, Persians, and the Greeks, and the Romans. Each world empire gets bigger and bigger each time. So here we have in the green, you have Hammurabi, his old empire, but all of that included into Nebuchadnezzar's empire, at least eventually. Nabopolassar became king of Babylon, and through several well-planned victories pushed the Assyrians into the north. Nabopolassar. In 612 BC, the Babylonians combined with the Medes and Scythians to destroy Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. They destroyed Nineveh in 612. The Assyrians retreated north to Haran, but the awesome power of the united Babylonian army drove them away. Suddenly, Egypt, a longtime enemy of Assyria, came to her aid against Babylon. And this is going to be trouble for Josiah. The decimated Assyrian army, together with support from Pharaoh Necho, the king of Egypt, decided to fight the Babylonian army based at Haran. They hoped to push the Babylonians out of the western Euphrates area. And Josiah gets himself very seriously killed in trying to stop it. In 2 Kings 23:29, in his days Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates, and King Josiah went to meet him. And when Pharaoh Necho saw him, he killed him at Megiddo. So Josiah seemed to understand the goal of the military campaign and sought to stop it, but he loses his life. Judah had gained independence from Assyria during Josiah's reign and had become an ally of the Babylonians. In 2 Chronicles 35:21, Josiah knew that Necho, the king of Egypt, was not coming to hurt or attack Judah at that time, and yet Josiah went out to fight. Necho had sent messengers to him saying, "What have we to do with each other, O king of Judah? I'm not coming against you today, but against the house with which I'm at war, and God has ordered me to hurry. Stop for your own sake from interfering with God who is with me, so that he will not destroy you." However, Josiah would not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to make war with him. Nor did he listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God that came to make war on the plain of Megiddo. So from these passages, Josiah should not have gone. But he did. After the battle of Carchemish, which was won by the Babylonians, Necho appointed a vassal king over Judah, making Judah a vassal state of Egypt. After a reign of 3 months, King Jehoahaz of Judah was taken to Egypt and died. 2 Kings 23:34. Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah, king in the place of Josiah's father, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. But he took Jehoahaz away and brought him to Egypt, and he died there. Necho placed Jehoiakim, a king he could control, on the throne. Jeremiah 26:1-6. Because of Judah's disobedience to God, Jeremiah began preaching her destruction. And it was not the most popular of messages. Matter of fact, they throw him in a cistern and do a lot of things to him. In the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, this word came from the Lord, saying, "Thus says the Lord, stand in the court of the Lord's house and speak to all the cities of Judah who have come to worship in the Lord's house all the words that I have commanded you to speak to them. Do not omit a word. Perhaps they will listen, and everyone will turn from his evil way, that I may repent of the calamity which I am planning to do to them because of the evil of their deeds. And you will say to them, Thus says the Lord, if you will not listen to me, to walk in my law which I have set before you, to listen to the words of my servants, the prophets, whom I have been sending to you again and again, but you have not listened, then I will make this house like Shiloh, and this city I will make a curse to all the nations of the earth." So just a quick recap. Josiah became king of Judah in 640 BC. Josiah began removing idolatry from Judah in 628 BC. Jeremiah began his ministry in 627 BC. And Zephaniah ministered sometime between 630 and 625 BC. And that's who we will look at after dinner.